Thank you also for the invitation, as Florian and the other organizers. Very happy to be here and meet all these people interested in laws of form and applications. As you can see in my, as you can, interpret from my title, Concept and Instance on the syntactic role of the so-called example, I want to give a very general talk, a very general epistemological talk concerning the relationship of this distinction. We have been discussing about it a little bit, of this, kind of undefinable distinction and instantiations of it. So I want to ask if what one can see then on a piece of paper, or what one can do by instantiating distinctions, is really the same as the first distinction, or if it is a difference, if there's a difference in between it.
Are you assuming there is a first distinction?
Excuse me? In assuming, yes.
How would you assume such a
Okay, the form of distinction. So I want to give you a, call it philosophical, epistemological, or in precisely dialectical approach to some of the central subject matters addressed by laws of form, as for example, form as distinction, form as sameness of form, invariance of form, giving an example of distinction, constructing a distinction, and formalization of distinction. My interest of this talk consists completely in the knowledge or thought process that accompanies Spencer Brown's introduction of a determinate syntax, starting by drawing a distinction, or better, by what he calls drawing a distinction. Of course, this restriction excludes a whole bunch of topics that were addressed in this morning, like specific syntactic questions in the former realm, and also applications of laws of form, as Dirk's talk, for example. The key issue in this respect consists in a, one might call it semanto-pragmatic, like the dialectics between semantic and pragmatic approaches, a semanto-pragmatic reconstruction of the formalization process carried out in laws of form itself. That starts, as you all know, I just repeat it shortly, that starts with preliminary remarks of on the nature of form and distinction in the various introductions. There are various, we know this. And then proceeds with chapter 1's significant shift from a supposed givenness of distinction. Lou addressed this topic. That is an indispensability or irreducibility of distinction for designating anything at all, which logically implies an indefinability of distinction, at least if you take a definition in the predicative sense, and proceeds further with an immediate contradiction of the indefinability claim by actually defining distinction in its form as perfect continence, followed by a spatialized understanding of perfect continence in taking the circle as an example of a drawn distinction, and then arriving at the equational form of the operations carried out by forming indifferent tokens of the operations. So I want to reconstruct this process, basically. I won't deal with the syntax and the formalism itself. The main result of this semanto-pragmatic reconstruction is a somehow, one might call it a somehow opposite understanding of the relationship between distinction as such, whatever this might be, as forming the basis of the whole construction, Spencer Brown's construction, and the initializing construction itself. Whereas one might say Spencer Brown takes this relationship between the founding concept and its instantiation as analytical, maybe, in the sense of explicating supposedly universal characteristics of the form. I will try to demonstrate that on the epistemological level, the relationship between what is called the form on the one side and its instantiation on the other side should be understood synthetically. That is, as a knowledge enlarging procedure by which the semantics of the term distinction changes through the process of its instantiation. That's my key thesis, maybe. I will interpret the movement from pure distinction, whatever this might be, but which is necessarily a self-referent concept, into this spatial construction as a movement from an impredicative, self-containing form into predicative determinateness, with which one can construct, instantiate things. Okay, so first of all, let's come to the form of distinction. Before the actual construction, including the so-called definition of distinction as perfect continence, Spencer-Brown points to what might be called the essence or the form of distinction, the invariant form of distinction, in different respects. And I want to pick out two of the key characteristics of form as distinction Spencer-Brown mentions in these several introductions to his book. We know there are several introductions, as I said. And I want to call these, these principles, or these two principles of distinction, A, unity of contradiction. This might be called a Hegelian prelude. And I quote, what a thing is and what it is not are in the form identical. Page number 9 of the newer edition from 97. And B, sameness of form with respect to change in appearance, what I would like to call a Wittgensteinian prelude, a Tractatus prelude. And I quote a sentence from Spencer-Brown: although all forms and thus all universes are possible, I skip something, the laws relating such forms are the same in any universe. You know, all know these sentences, I guess. So why do I mention this unity of contradiction, as I call it, and the sameness of form principles? My first reason is both of these alleged principles do represent, so to speak, classical, well-known positions in philosophizing about form and logic. Yeah. So, as I already mentioned, the unity of contradiction dictum traces back to Hegel's dialectical conception of the relationship between identity and difference in the science of logic. I will come back to this a little later, the identity of identity and difference. The sameness of form dictum, one could say, goes back to Wittgenstein's Tractatus, to his Tractatus conception of form as a structure-preserving mapping function. It's a Tractatus conception of form, not the philosophical investigations. We know that he skipped all these Tractatus insights in the philosophical investigations. But in the Tractatus, he says, form is a mapping function in between sentences, and this is sameness. Sameness is being repeated. Form as identity, as sameness. Now one could ask, why does, and I don't want to ask it psychologically, well, I want to ask this systematically, why does, as a mathematician, Spencer-Brown mention these two, like, canonical positions towards form, which, by the way, differ profoundly from another. These two differ profoundly. We can discuss it. I don't want to. The sameness of form and the identity of identity and non-identity differ. But we can come back to this later. Okay, why does he do it? One could give a very trivial or simple answer to this question and say, well, in an introduction, one mentions a theme of a book. Yeah? This is a usual factual truth. Nothing to wonder about. This is nothing one should ask. But I would say that in Spencer-Brown's case, this trivial point deserves a little more attention for the following reason. Spencer-Brown repeatedly emphasizes that nothing can be known by uttering or understanding denotational propositions of the form, this is so-and-so, but only by following orders by reconstructive rule following. Yeah, he says this, for example, on page 10 in the 1997 edition, but he says this at several occasions, that you have to obey rules, you have to obey commands, and then you understand intuitively, and you cannot understand anything by hearing or uttering or reading a definition. Now, there are, to my estimation, there are mainly two critical questions related to this, like intuitionistic dogma, which I would ask you to keep in mind maybe during my line of thought. The first critical question: can the principles regarding form, those two principles which I mentioned, be translated into a form of rule following without significantly changing them? And second, because the second question, it's connected to one, do these principles, the identity, unity of complements, and the sameness of form, do these principles reappear in the constructive part of laws of form? If yes, how do they reappear? And additionally, what is their function? What is the function of these very general universal principles in this construction? My assumption is, and I would love to discuss it with you, that neither of these principles can simply be translated into rule following, neither the Hegelian identity of identity and non-identity, nor Wittgenstein's assumed underlying, I call it, transcendental form homogeneity of the Tractatus. Hegel's unity of complements from the science of logic, the dialectical logic that he developed, can only be displayed as part of a reflection process. You have to undergo this certain reflection process. Wittgenstein's form as identity of mapping principle is the conditio sine qua non for the whole argumentation of the Tractatus. So as such, both are necessary conditions of and for rule following, differing from mere rule following itself. If my assumption of the general impossibility to translate general insights into the form of form into rule following, or into a formal rule in general, proves to be somehow convincing, then Spencer-Brown's form principles might have a different function for the construction than being their operational starting point. Instead of being part of rule following, the form principles might function as some kind of intentional object of the construction. It's whereof, one might call it in a strange way of saying it. In this case, the function of the principles of form would be unification of otherwise meaningless operations. Its function would be a semantic one, similar to the unifying function of pure concepts in, for example, Kant's critique of pure reason. If you think of the schematization of concepts, or of the necessity to schematize concepts in Kant it is a temporal succession, as temporal intuition, but into spatial temporal intuitions in general. Okay, so maybe we can keep in mind my questions concerning the role of the principles of form. Maybe one can keep that in mind. But now let's proceed to chapter 1, where the formalizing movement of chapter 2 is prepared through stating two so-called axioms. You all know it, it's just a repetition, but I'll give you an interpretation of it. First, the law of calling. The value of a call made again is the value of the call. And second, the law of crossing. The value of a crossing made again is not the value of the crossing. Before stating and explaining the two so-called axioms of distinction, Spencer-Brown refers to, first, the givenness of the idea of distinction, and provides a second so-called definition. I already mentioned it. Now let's stick for a moment at this, at first glimpse, maybe evident sentence. And Lou also said it's just it might be a pseudo sentence or something, or it just appears an English sentence. I quote, "We take as given the idea of distinction and the idea of indication, and that we cannot make an indication without drawing a distinction. We take, therefore, the form of distinction for the form." Sounds trivial. For indicating something as something, it is necessary to distinguish something. What is undistinguished cannot be meaningfully indicated. Totally right, totally trivial. But what does that mean for the methodology of laws of form? How can we, so to speak, capture the form of distinction, although it is presupposed in and for every indicating act? So this is also a classical question, a classical philosophical question. How can we capture this or that which is presupposed in every act? How can we capture meaning when meaning is always presupposed, and so on? I could give different examples of these situations of self-referentiality with which philosophical theory, epistemology is confronted. One classical strategy, one might call it, of facing this inescapability of self-referentiality consists in adhering to some kind of phenomenology of form, in contrast to definite descriptions. This is a classical, I would call it a classical strategy of facing situations of self-referentiality, distinguishing phenomenological and, say, logical aspects from each other. As Wittgenstein, I quote Wittgenstein again, as Wittgenstein repeatedly stresses in the Tractatus, form cannot be said but shows itself. You all know this, showing and saying what can be said cannot be shown, and vice versa. So the unifying function in the Tractatus conception, that is form as unity, or form in itself, can only be located on the level of presentation, not on the level of representation, which, by the way, is also a position that some of the logical or methodological constructivists hold and held. In this case, so if one pursues this strategy, form as unity is not being put into definite descriptions, but necessitates a change in the medium in which it is reconstructed. From linguistic definitions to spatio-temporal constructions, which supposedly show instead of define something. So this would be one strategy. I don't want to comment at the moment if it is a convincing strategy, but it can be found a strategy. Even with Wittgenstein, who I wouldn't call a phenomenologist, but he has this phenomenological element, and of course also the whole phenomenological tradition adheres to this kind of strategy. Okay, 5 minutes. Now Spencer, I try to shorten. Spencer Brown's dealing with this general problem when it comes to the problem of the impredicativity of distinction might be described as twofold. On the formal level, he contradicts his own statement. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Of the indispensability of distinction by actually giving a definition of distinction. Distinction is perfect continence. So, direct contradiction, starting with a direct contradiction. But as regards the content, which is, by the way, Lou already mentioned it, it's not a predication, but it's kind of a substitution, or it's an equation in which you can substitute names. Distinction is perfect continence. The following happens. One might say, operationally useless general form of distinction is being replaced by a spatial metaphor, the one of perfect continence. Now, with the help of this spatial picture, whose function is metaphorical, that is taking distinction to somewhere else, it becomes possible to reinterpret the identity of complements as a two-sidedness of extensional closures. And I quote Spencer Brown, what he says to perfect continence, that is to say, a distinction is drawn by arranging a boundary with separate sides so that a point on one side cannot reach the other side without crossing the boundary. For example, in a plane space, a circle draws a distinction. This shift to this spatial version of distinction from the general version is profound, I would say. And now, for the last, I have maybe 3 minutes, because if one comes from a Hegelian point of view that I'm taking today, there's really a difference between identity and non-identity, and this spatial version of a circle drawing a distinction. If you understand the identity of non-identity, the unity of complements, as a sameness with respect to a third thing, as Spencer Brown does in giving the example of a circle, a common boundary as a third thing. This is already, one might say, a derivative meaning of the original identity of identity and non-identity. Well, I don't have the time. I might give you the Hegelian, if you want to later, because identity of identity and non-identity is a conceptual derivation. Why pure identity and why pure non-identity are the same? Because pure identity is the absence of any otherness, and any otherness puts it into itself, but then it is lacks of identity, and so it switches from identity to non-identity. I will go and we can talk about this later. One might call this movement from this purely like dialectical definition, identity of identity and non-identity, to the spatial one, in accordance with Kant, a schematizing movement. Recall for Kant that for Kant only schematized, that is temporalized in Kant's case, concepts are valid concepts. That is, concepts playing a functional role in and for structuring intuition. The two so-called axioms already contain this schematized, in Spencer Brown's case, spatialized version of distinction as identity, of identity and non-identity, as they express equality and non-equality with respect to a third, a spatial boundary, and therefore become indifferent towards each other. They can stand there. You can look at these two sides. You can say, oh, this is inside and this is outside, with respect to boundary. You couldn't do this with pure identity of identity and non-identity. You would not could not stay on one side. Such a schematization, I would say, is a general necessity for a singularization that is an instantiation of a general concept. From here on, that is, from distinction considered as separated, indifferent sides, treated as, I know everybody of you knows that, of course, these sides are not simple separations, but you treat them, when you draw a circle, you treat them as indifferent sides. Indifferent sides with reference to a third, a boundary function, then marking operations become possible. Then token constitution becomes possible. The whole formal rearm as a rearm of indifference comes into being. Not least the two equations, number and order, become possible as further schematizations of the already schematized axioms into a syntax of indications in which the sides of distinction are being sublated, one might say, into syntactical positions. But remember, the laws in the form, or the laws in the laws of the form, are and were from the beginning laws of schematization. That's it. Yeah. Yes.
So, from your point of view, how do you think about the fact that there are many distinctions in our speaking which do not have a delineated boundary of any sort?
Well, could you give an example?
0 and 1, no longer in the line, just two numbers.
0 and 1, no, just two numbers, yeah.
One object, two objects. There's no boundary between them.
Yeah. I don't know if I can...
Truth and beauty, all right?
Truth and what?
Truth and beauty.
Beauty, truth and beauty.
Where's the boundary?
Oh, I didn't want, no, so...
Yeah, I'm not saying you're holding Spencer Brown's position,
yeah.
but Spencer Brown has to be understood to be a kind of magician who will do a little sleight of hand and take you down a road which you call profound into something which is apparently quite clear, and I'm not sure you could say that he's not pulling the wool over your eyes at the same time.
Yeah. You know, my point was, maybe we can come together then when I reconstruct it. My point is that in this, is in general, beyond this talk, that there is in this, that the complicated thing, that the complexity sits in this schematization process itself. And this is there's the problem. How do you come from this general concepts to instantiations, to a logic that then can start, that then can start by saying something and generalizing it, maybe. So the whole logic of particular and universal can start to come into being. But what does this formalization process, I would call it, consist in? And I would say this is a syntactic. It's a synthetic process in which what has been the starting point is reconstructed.
See, I would make a caricature of it like this. This guy comes up to you and he says, I'm going to tell you about distinctions. You know, they're very general.
Yeah.
But look, let's just look at some examples here. I draw a circle here, and that's inside and that's outside. And now we could use this as a symbol, and we'll start playing. And then it goes on. And he isn't trying to do anything that sounds profound. He's just saying, here's an example of a distinction. Let's play with this. But of course, Spencer Brown doesn't do that. He sounds like he's being much more profound than that. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure what went on, because in fact, it feels like he is being profound here, and then he jumps into the example.
Yes.
And I always took it as, well, I think it's a good idea. Let's look at examples and then see if those very general ideas are right.
But then the profound form is the mapping, and then it is even again a much more, you might call it, I don't know, mathematical concept of form, because then it becomes a mapping function from the universal idea to the instantiation. Then this is form.
Well,
then
if
this
there
is
were a mapping function.
Yeah, if there were. Or if there's not, yeah. What if there's no mapping function? Yes. I don't know.
But there is the injunction.
Yeah.
Make a distinction.
Yeah, that's the
right.
So two things. Thank you. It was a very provocative talk. Really interesting. Firstly, you said something about concepts and intuition, but I missed the link there.
I said repeatedly something, because I think that, I don't know in which context you're asking, I just repeat. But Spencer Brown, in his general attitude towards mathematics, and maybe also in his general philosophical attitude, might be seen in the neighborhood of this intuitionistic mathematics, in which a valid construction is always a construction of an existence and an existing object, and so also has some kind of phenomenology in it. Yeah? Not a construction like with classical logics, where you prove by contradiction, and then for example, and then you say, well, this cannot exist, so it doesn't exist, so I've proven the opposite. This is a very abstract form. But proving by, like, phenomenologically demonstrating the necessary existence of something. So this is the thing that or this is the reason why I said he somehow adheres to this phenomenological point of view towards mathematical object, or the world of mathematics. So, yeah.
Okay, which leads me to my second thing.
Yeah.
There was a lot about what in your talk, not much about why. So my question to you is, why distinctions? Why schematization?
Well, I think, I don't know if I can answer the question, because I just, I have thought about this for many, many years. And And I was just asking myself, is it really the laws of distinction? Is it the subject, or the laws of form as distinction? Or is something happening under the ground? Why? I mean, his why, I think, is quite obvious. He wants to be very general. I mean, he's talking about the universe. I mean, you cannot be more general, I think. So this is his reason. And well, my reason is that I do see a lot of similarities between this Spencer Brownian conception of mathematical form, or form as this kind of two-sidedness of distinction, and this classical precursors like Hegel, for example. That's why I quoted. Yeah, I mean, you can see if you look into the science of logic, you can see. I mean, this unity of identity principle is explicitly there. I mean, it's in other places too, in like Buddhist conceptions. So this is a widely spread principle. But you can see it, and you can also see how somebody is making a logic out of it. It's not a formal logic. It is like a genesis of form in Hegel's concept. And so you can put these two approaches together, or compare them, and you see what might be the formal side here might be reflected on the other side in a more contentious way. So that's why I am dealing with this.
So I think we have time for 1 minute for Joel's question and 1 minute for response.
Okay. This is not to belabor what Lou asked you, but it's somewhat along the same lines. So you mentioned Wittgenstein and the rule following way. In some sense, when people look at the laws of forms, there is this Wittgenstein is in the room someplace, but it's actually not the case, because Spencer Brown very clearly says and speaks about this whole imperative aspect of mathematics, in which you say draw a distinction, prove a theorem, take an example, pull. That's the way. That's a way into getting into the doorway to an ontology, right? And from my point of view, I mean, at least as far as I can ascend the book, it is much closer to a Platonist point of view, a mathematical point of view, a mathematical realism, than it is close to constructivism as you were putting together. So other people completely differ about this, but are you sure about that side?
No, it's a very good question. It's very difficult because, of course, the rule following that, or this command and reaction, command do something that Spencer Brown wants you to obey, is an ideal one. I mean, it is not any rule following, but it is already informed by an ideal concept. And he doesn't like explain where this ideal concept comes from, or if he's the universal teacher that has this concept in mind. So I would say you're right. This is a special form of constructivism or non-construct that has much more similarity, for example, to Hegel's conception of the dialectical movement, which is also not constructivist in any way, but wants to explicate thought as such. Wants to make explicit thought as, that would be my answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much.